For coming to this final session of CIRCA hosted webinar series. Some housekeeping just to get us started. We will be recording this webinar and it will be posted to CIRCA's website in a couple days. I'll also send out an email to everyone who's registered for the webinar, which will have the recording in it. At this moment, you do not have the ability to turn on your audio and video. However, when we get to the discussion portion of the webinar, CIRCA will be turning on those features for you. Also, feel free to put any questions in the chat as they come up, and then we can read them off once we get to the discussion portion of the webinar. So this webinar series is a continuation effort after our research symposium and research seed grant, and it's aimed at showcasing the research efforts of UConn faculty members and fostering collaboration within the university's community. We've held 4 webinars, this being the 4th, over the past 2 weeks, and each one of those webinars centered around CIRCA's 4 research interest areas. Today's webinar will focus on climate justice and equity and public health and emergency management, and will highlight Dr. Eleanor Ouimet. Elle is an assistant professor of anthropology, and her research and teachings are focused on human-environment interactions, including community-based conservation, environmental justice, disaster preparedness, energy equity, and climate change. She's also the PI of the disaster research team, which I believe she'll speak on a bit, and has worked with CIRCA on multiple projects. So thank you, Elle, for being here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I will just attempt to share my screen. And then, okay, so can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right, so what I want to talk to you about today is a project that I've been working on with an interdisciplinary team here at UConn that consists of anthropologists, communications experts, geographers, as well as a broader team of engineers, geoscientists, extension agents, and ecologists from across the university. And what I want to talk to you about in terms of this project is really the extent to which we're trying to examine preparedness disparity across the state of Connecticut. This work began in 2022 with interviews with emergency management personnel to understand the challenges that they're facing in the state of Connecticut that relies primarily on volunteer emergency personnel to respond to increasingly frequent climate-related hazard events. Since that time, we've run a large survey across 4 of the 8 counties in Connecticut, and we're preparing right now to do the remaining counties to assess resident perceptions of preparedness, trust in local authorities and emergency personnel, and the needs of residents. And as we start preparing to do this, the second half of the study, I wanted to share a bit about the background of this research and the implications of the results to date. So I'll briefly talk about climate change and preparedness in Connecticut. Compared to the rest of the country, I'm sure everyone here is well aware, and other regions of the world, we really don't hear much about climate change in New England. But the truth is that New England, as CIRCA knows better than most, right, is on the brink of serious effects of climate change. Right? The latest estimates claim that by 2035, the Northeast is expected to be more than 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it was on average before the Industrial Revolution. That we have some of the highest rates of both sea level rise and ocean warming, and that the region is in the top 3 areas in the US that risk for billion-dollar winter storm disasters associated with nor'easter events. Southern New England also faces ever-increasing hurricane risks as a climate change-induced weakening of the high-pressure zone off the mid-Atlantic is causing hurricane activity to move northward. And between 1980 and 2021, there have been over 35 major weather-related disaster events in Connecticut. And over 19 of those occurred in the last decade and have cost well over $30 billion and have left hundreds of thousands of households, as I'm sure all of you have experienced, without power for days to weeks at a time. But the risks to local communities posed by these increasingly severe and increasingly frequent events plays out in Connecticut against a backdrop of increasing economic vulnerability. In the state of Connecticut, there's about approximately 11% of residents live under the poverty line. But over 27% of households qualify as what is known as ALICE. This stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, but Employed. It's the United Way's metrics for discussing the challenges facing households earning just above the federal poverty level, but still struggling to afford basic expenses. And most alarming is the fact that over 47% of seniors, over 57% of Black households, and over 63% of Hispanic households live under the ALICE threshold. Compounding these statistics is the reality that many small quintessential New England towns in Connecticut, whose historic affluence hides rampant economic inequality, also tend to be those that lack full-time social services programs, food banks, shelters, emergency operations centers, and they're reliant upon a decreasing number of aging volunteers to provide adequate emergency support to growing numbers of socioeconomically vulnerable residents. So despite the increasing social and environmental risks, according to Connecticut's response framework, which is a document put out by the Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security in the state, and I quote, "The majority of disasters in Connecticut are still managed locally. They are," in quotes, "the responsibility for responding to incidents, both natural and man-made, begins at the local level." Connecticut's state response framework is intended to lay out how the state of Connecticut and its partners work together to support local governments and their residents in response to disasters and emergencies. But as stated in the SRF, end quotes, "The majority of local emergency management directors are part-time directors with no staff support. Most of these part-time directors are volunteers." The SRF further underlines that the responsibility to respond to incidents begins with these volunteers. According to SRF, volunteer EMDs are responsible for everything from developing and executing public awareness and education programs to involving the public, governmental partners, the private sector, and non-governmental organizations in planning, training, and exercises. This includes, as one EMD stated to us pretty bluntly, everything from dealing with downed tree limbs to school shootings. Perhaps most problematic, however, are the expectations for EMDs and residents that are laid out in what the SRF calls their planning assumptions. And this includes that residents who, and I quote, "anticipate needing special care in emergency situations will inform their functional need requirements to their local EMDs or other local officials before an emergency occurs." Another assumption states that EMDs will be able to, quote, "provide continual public awareness and education to ensure residents and businesses take precautions to reduce their emergency vulnerability, especially during and immediately after disaster impact." Additional assumptions that are in the SRF include things like local governments will use their resources as well as mutual aid before requesting assistance from the state, that local officials will initiate actions that save lives, protect property and the environment, and maintain direction and control of the resources in their areas. In short, what we're seeing is that the SRF assumes that effective preparedness begins at the level of the volunteer and requires intensive preparations and effective and early communication. But the SRF gives very little regard to the evolving nature of volunteerism in emergency services, which has been on a rapid decline worldwide, nor the reality of inadequate support and preparedness at the local level, as the funding available to these volunteer EMD departments has been stagnant for close to a decade. So these issues are part of what's being examined by UConn's disaster research team. And like I said, this is an interdisciplinary team of anthropologists, communications researchers, geographers, ecologists, engineers, And our focus is really on examining the roots and the implications of this disparity in climate change disaster preparedness and risk, and to offer information and resources to policymakers, community members, and emergency services in order to improve crisis and risk communication in advance of disaster scenarios. So for this present study, the disaster research team identified areas vulnerable to hazards by evaluating environmental exposure, infrastructural risk, and geospatial mapping of social vulnerability using an index called the Social Vulnerability Index, also known as SOVI, and environmental injustice using the Justice 40 mapping tool across the state of Connecticut. Through these initial screenings, we identified 4 Connecticut counties, that included municipalities at various levels of potential risk for future hazard events that exhibited a range of social vulnerability indicators, Justice 40 burden thresholds, from which to start collecting community-based information. So we started by conducting interviews with municipal emergency management personnel on issues surrounding town-level emergency preparedness, as well as public works employees on municipal infrastructural maintenance challenges. We conducted focus groups with residents in select towns and cities. And these data informed the development of a resident survey that was designed to assess resident risk assessment, awareness, information sufficiency, and preparedness to identify areas for future resident level research. So just to kind of give you a quick overview, we ultimately ended up interviewing about 17 emergency management directors, 4 regional coordinators, and regional coordinators are those who kind of the intermediaries between the state and the local EMDs, 19 public works directors for about 27 towns in total represented. And if we're looking at the themes, what we really pulled away from these interviews and the themes that were repeatedly emphasized time and time again really revealed a fragile, relatively unsustainable, and non-inclusive volunteer-based emergency management system that was comprised of a really dwindling number of overburdened, aging, predominantly white male volunteers. EMDs repeatedly highlighted issues in communications, and ranging from the lack of appropriate technology to aid in emergencies, to the challenge of changing community demographics and not being able to reach community members. They repeatedly noted the lack of community knowledge of what to do in disasters, the lack of space and time and resources to conduct that type of education. As well as the lack of state-level resources to support much-needed hiring, educating and preparing the public, and equipping their communities in light of these increasing events with the necessary tools, educational materials, etc., that they would need to sustain themselves. So, kind of to give you a brief overview also of the resident survey. In order to compare the EMD responses, we really wanted to see what did it look like when we juxtaposed what the EMDs were saying about preparedness in the state to what residents were really talking about in terms of their own experiences. And so we conducted an online survey of residents in the same 4 counties, and using survey instruments that were designed to assess risk perception, information sufficiency, the extent to which people believe themselves to have sufficient amounts of information and access to information, the importance of various media sources and reliance on various media sources, as well as trying to gauge trust in public health and emergency services. What we're finding is that the increasing frequency and severity of hazards due to climate change, the state's continued reliance on volunteers for municipal emergency services, and increasing socioeconomic disparity have created a real disconnect between emergency preparedness and response and at-risk individuals and communities who are already coping with intersectional societal assaults lodged by structural violence, systemic racism, lack of equitable institutional support from everything from education, healthcare, food access, and basic needs. Together, the interviews with EMDs and the surveys amongst residents revealed a high degree of self-awareness of marginalization reflected in the desire for information concerning extreme weather. What does this mean? It really means that there's a large portion of the population, predominantly minoritized communities, who are very aware that there's a large amount of information that they don't have. We saw that over 70% of African Americans and over 43% of Hispanic individuals who were surveyed responded that they did not know or they were unsure of their town's emergency management plan. Nearly half of those that stated that their needs were not being served by their town's emergency services make less than $49,000 a year. We're seeing that the most marginalized residents who are recognizing that they're missing critical information and support services are trying to seek them out. And they're expressing preference for in-person sources of hazard information from friends, family members, community centers, libraries. They're seeking information from the places where they would seek help anyway, right? Regardless of the topic. Meanwhile, we're also seeing wealthy or predominantly white residents actually overestimating the readiness of emergency services and management plans and 911 response to respond and be able to respond adequately and effectively in advance of or following a disaster scenario. We're seeing that racially minoritized and impoverished residents in general, those who score higher on social vulnerability indices across the board, like I said, are seeking more preparedness information than less vulnerable residents. They're more likely to feel outrage and distrust towards municipal preparedness strategies and officials. And like I said, they're asking for more person-to-person sources of emergency information and disaster-related information. Here, I've just kind of juxtaposed a few responses from the plethora of responses that we received that just are excerpts from residents who participated in the survey, expressing their frustration at local emergency services, juxtaposed to feedback from a few of the EMDs that we interviewed who were bemoaning the lack of personnel, lack of state funding, and talking about their experience being spread far too thin, as well as the lack of resident risk awareness. We also had a number of EMDs complaining about sort of the politicking requirements of their positions, right? That they were always up against the school budget as to whether or not their department was going to get any funding, and you know whether who was on the board of the town council, right, had a lot to do with whether or not the emergency services in a town received any recognition. So we're seeing is that crises are occurring more frequently and on a larger scale, and they're causing greater harm. Yet historically underserved groups remain under-resourced and in need of information. To this end, what we can really see is that there's a high degree of importance placed on needs-based community engaged emergency management and messaging that really needs to be evaluated and implemented quite soon in Connecticut. So we see, like I said, this collision of increasing socioeconomic vulnerability, increasing risk of weather-related hazards and events, and an inadequately supported state system of emergency response. Connecticut's SRF, it could be argued, kind of frees the state from the financial responsibility as well as the hands-on process of preemptive preparedness. And this is a worldwide issue. Disaster anthropologists talk a lot about the fact that there's very little research or hands-on work being done to address the roots of inequity when it comes to the impacts of disaster, and most of it comes on response in the aftermath. But we're also seeing that economic insecurity among residents is continuing to increase, and the ability of town-level volunteers to meet resident needs in the face of increasing risks associated with climate change is declining. As a result, we see a gap growing in Connecticut between preparedness and poverty. And this is a risk space that is increasing numbers of marginalized and economically vulnerable residents are continuing to fill. So based on the data that we've collected so far, and like I said, we're continuing to collect more, working on surveying and conducting the same interviews in the second half of the state. We offer a few data-based recommendations to policymakers. Based on our data, we're seeing that disaster management policies and planning needs to focus on recognizing the influence of extended families and social networks. Crisis communication needs to initiate at the community level and largely be dispersed through trusted community institutions, the places where people who need help are already seeking help: libraries, schools, community centers, senior centers, food banks, churches. Risk awareness and preparedness education should also be presented through these trusted community institutions. Crisis responders really are in a position where it may be very beneficial to build relationships with community leaders at these institutions to more effectively get information to those who may be in harm's way. Risk education on preparedness strategies and municipal policies also need to be provided in multimedia forms, whether that is alert notification schedules, parking restrictions, resource allocations, shelters, cooling centers. These need to be in radio, they need to be in mailings, emails, bulletins, and they need to be available in English as well as English as a second language and for non-English speaking residents. We see a severe lack of diversity in emergency management directors, as well as the fact that those numbers are dwindling and fewer people have the space and capacity to volunteer across the volunteer realms. But we do see this very dramatically in emergency services. And so there needs to be an active effort to try to enhance the diversity of emergency response personnel by including women and racially minoritized groups. This can be achieved by expanding outreach to schools and community colleges, public health facilities, and any of those trusted institutions that we spoke about before. Today, many of these volunteer positions are held by those whose parents held the positions. And moving into a place of inclusivity and expanding and recognizing that that community demographics are far different than they used to be, right? Means making sure that the personnel that represent and support the communities reflect that type of diversity. And finally, state funding is desperately needed to facilitate these part-time positions, to facilitate attracting not just new volunteers, but also paid positions. There's a serious need for updated emergency communication systems, emergency plan development, resident risk and preparedness education programming. This is certainly an area that across the board, EMDs made very clear that not only are they overburdened because there's not enough volunteers, but they're overburdened that they don't have the resources to execute what's expected of them in the SRF with the really small amount of resources that is made available by the state. So in terms of moving forward, right, we plan to extend a survey to the remaining 4 Connecticut counties over this coming year. We're also planning on interviewing EMDs as well as public works directors over the coming year. And where we're also going with this is to recognize the fact that a huge amount of disaster preparedness and preemptive action and community level support is coming through the community institutions that I was talking about earlier. We see libraries keeping their doors open longer, providing extension cords, charging stations, child support. We see community centers, senior centers, food banks being the places where a huge amount of this disaster support is taking place. And sometimes this is happening without the recognition or awareness of municipal officials. Not always, but oftentimes. And so one of the things that we're also working on is sort of looking at those individuals and institutions that play that larger sort of exterior peripheral role in establishing climate equity across the state. And this is just a couple places to find more information on some of the work that we're doing. So that's all I have. Thank you. I will stop sharing.
Great, thank you, Elle.
Yeah, thank you.
Nicole and I are just switching all of the attendees to panelists. So as you see yourselves appear on the screen, you'll have the ability to unmute and turn on your video if you'd like to. You can also ask a question in the chat if you prefer. We'll be watching that too.
Yeah, so does anybody have any questions for Elle?
See a hand from Matt.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, folks, how are you? Good to see
Nice
you.
to see you.
Yes, thank you so much for the very good presentation, Elle. So a couple things. One on the, and I'm trying to lower my hand. I'm sorry, my mouse isn't cooperating. I'll get to that after I ask my question. So for data collection purposes, you may know the Census Bureau has given COGS county equivalency. So I don't know if you're thinking of switching to that methodology as opposed to using the counties. You know, we haven't had county government in decades here. So I think that's one of the reasons that's the main reason why we were able to obtain that, which is great. But then secondly, and more importantly, I'm wondering if you have had an opportunity to present your findings to the 5 DEMIS regions. So I do think that this would be very informative for them.
That's one of our primary goals of this work, because working with the regional coordinators who are responsible for those 5 regions was incredibly informative and helpful. And so we prepared a report that we've distributed to those. And in terms of the counties, we haven't switched over to the COGS breakdown, but I think that's a really important point, because certainly what has arisen in this, and I harp on all the time, which I think a lot of people do, is the fact that when we're looking at the disparity across communities in terms of emergency services, it aligns with the disparity across communities in terms of social services in general, which has largely in Connecticut stems from the fact, like you said, we don't have county level governance, and towns towns rely on their tax base, and so those that need the most support have the least resources.
Right.
And it's perpetuated because there's not an incentive necessarily for some communities who are fairly affluent to change the system. And so it's led to a huge amount of racial and ethnic wealth disparity and segregation in the state. And we see that, you know, in all social services, but certainly in emergency services as well. So I think it would be interesting to look at the COG breakdown as because it offers sort of an additional level of oversight that we don't necessarily have at the traditional county level.
Good, thank you.
Looks like Mark also has his hand up. So.
Yes, I'm Dr. Mark Mitchell. I know Mary and a few other folks. I co-chair the Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I was previously the director of the Hartford Health Department. And before that, I was in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was involved with emergency planning for the health department there. I have a quick question. First of all, what are the 4 counties that you have surveyed?
Holland, Wyndham, New London, and Middlesex.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first one.
Oh, Tolland.
Okay. Wyndham, New London, and Middlesex. Okay. Okay. And then so you're going to be doing the others. I've also, you know, been very much concerned about about emergency response and planning. I used to run the Connecticut Coalition for Environmental Justice, and it seemed like the environmental threats that we were facing were not even on the radar of the emergency planners at the time. This was 15 years ago that I was doing that. But now I don't have, I wouldn't even know where to start to identify the emergency planning systems that are in place. I have also been working on a document on how to get equity into planning, particularly on the municipal level. And so we published that as part of the governor's Council on Climate Change, the GC3. We had I was part of the equity and environmental justice work group. And so we published something like that along with Yale, and trying to figure out how to get that into the hands of planners and emergency planners. So we talk about some of the things that you talked about today. How to reach out to, how to find out which vulnerable groups are in your communities, what kind of trusted messengers, how to reach trusted messengers, how to find out about how to reach those specific groups. And so anyway, I'd be happy to share that, but I'm not sure how that gets to the people who need it.
Yeah, no, I would love to see it. I would love to chat at another time as well, because I mean, I think there's a lot, this overlaps with so many, like you mentioned, that it overlaps with public health, it overlaps with social equity, it overlaps with environmental justice, it overlaps with disaster preparedness and climate change adaptation in the state. And the system in place, it's just kind of outdated, in the sense that, like you said, how do we reach those who need the most help, as opposed to relying on a system where we're expecting people who need the most help to contact us well in advance of a disaster? That doesn't happen.
Right.
And so it's sort of it's a process that needs revising in the face of climate change, and in revising in the name of establishing social equity across the state.
Yeah. So thanks for doing this, and it's very informative, and hope that we can bring this elsewhere. Yeah. Actually, right on the call right before this, I was just talking to, or there was another physician talking about how at UConn stores for their summer program that they have, students that they bring from communities that are disadvantaged communities, and they have no air conditioning, and they don't allow them to have air conditioning unless they have notes from their physician saying that it's medically necessary, and that it's really unbearably hot, and obviously difficult to learn. And so anyway, it's just a lot of things need to be updated, like you said, and they're and people who live their daily lives in air conditioning, like me, don't necessarily have any kind of awareness that this is happening, or that there are these kinds of rules and restrictions that are in place that make it very difficult for low-income people and even students at UConn to to be able to face the kinds of challenges, the climate challenges that we're only going to see more of.
Yeah, yeah. And it's happening fast.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, I don't see any other hands at the moment. Feel free to raise them or to put something in the chat. And I think Nicole might be having a technical issue, but she's in the room with me, so if need be, she can come over here. Oh, I see Matt again. Yes.
Yeah, one more thought, and I hate to put my OPM colleague Joanna on the spot, but what type of linkages might you see between L's findings and Senate Bill 11, if any?
Is that a question for me, or is it for
if you're open to commenting?
I think that's for you. Senate Bill 11, I'm not sure what that is.
Fair enough. Yeah, what SB 11 was, what the goal of SB 11 was dealing with the multi-sector challenges related to creating a resilient system. And it dealt with water supply, sewage, emergency management, long-term planning and identifying vulnerable locations. So it really was a neat little package addressing a multitude of issues. There's also interscalar, which I know that's obviously critical, and Al's presentation was getting at this. It was dealing with local, regional, and state authorities and connecting them. And because so often, as you're already pointing out, is that this coordination is critical, and it's often complicated and it takes time. And so if we don't stack our data, our knowledge, or or even just our leadership in a cohesive way, so often the other pieces can fall apart easily. So that's what SB 11 was hoping to do. So maybe we'll try not to think too far ahead, but we'll see for next session.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but I was gonna, thanks for bringing that up, Matt, I appreciate it. But I also think that what's neat about this research is a connection between, I think it's highlighting some of the hyperlocal issues that need to be addressed. And it's basically a system change, I think. When you're talking about being able to recruit members that reflect the community, or members that can reach the most vulnerable populations in your community. I think there's also partnership opportunities. I have many conversations with Chris Burton about this, actually, but
yeah,
the time scales related between public health and emergency management are slightly different in both the preparedness and the recovery stages. So if we can get those aligned a bit better, which is entire bodies of work, so it's a little bit challenging, but if we can get those to align better, I think the education opportunities, or the sufficiency education, that was one of the comments from your interviews, I think that could be addressed better through that partnership.
Yeah, the information sufficiency aspect of it, absolutely. There's also been discussions across, a lot of interdisciplinary discussions about what would training programs look like at the high school or community college level. There's even the extent in terms of Connecticut workforce development. How do you provide opportunities for people who are interested in investing in their own communities to get involved? And it's a challenge. And when we think about volunteers, it may not be a sustainable system any longer for emergency services, but where that funding is going to come from is also a huge challenge. And like you said, opening it up to spaces that reflect the entire community. Right now, when it comes to volunteerism and emergencies in the emergency sector, there's a lot of correlations between those who go into volunteering for EMDs that have a background in police, fire, military, and that's not always the most welcoming, or that's not always the space that a lot of residents feel comfortable. Those are not necessarily the folks that a lot of people are saying, yeah, come into my home. And so there's a gap there where you actually have, you know, an increasing distance between residents and those with the authority to actually provide the assistance, as well as you know, just emergency communications. A lot of the EMDs didn't know the extent to which they were effectively notifying their populations when there was a crisis. Some of them had Twitter, occasionally Facebook. Some of them talked about Everbridge as a statewide emergency alert system. One resident had heard of Everbridge according to this resident survey. And so, but the EMDs also said, like, we can't take people off or on Everbridge. So, you know, we may be sending it to people who have already passed. We don't know, we can't monitor the list. And so there was big communications issues. So like you said, it's very systemic in a lot of different areas.
Right, and I just want to call everyone's attention to Dr. Mitchell put the link to the guide that he mentioned into the chat. So Ellen, anyone else, if you want to.
Oh, thank you so much.
For that.
That's great.
All right, not seeing any other hands. I might offer a prompt, which is that we've been talking a lot about the, you know, the roles of the towns versus the COGs versus the state. And given that one of the goals of the original research symposium, which led to this webinar series, was thinking about the role of the university and researchers within the university, and this is a really great example of how university research is filling a gap in knowledge. Are there other opportunities or other gaps that you see in this area where university researchers could be playing a role?
Or anybody else on the call? Is there, from any of these, you know, Matt, I know you're from COG, Joanna, OPM, and Mark Mitchell, but are there gaps people are seeing where research needs to be done?
I probably have a whole book of ideas, but that's too much. But I think that the highlighting, when we're talking about systemic issues, or they are interscalar, or they're sort of like across regulatory programs, I think it's really hard to unpack those programs. And so when there's research that can dig into those, and really seeing where there's disconnects along the system, I think it's very, very hard for policymakers to see all of those when that's, especially in Connecticut, where they have to have another job. It's not a full-time legislature. And so when you're dealing with such a wicked problem, it's really hard to dig into it, and it can take years and years. And we know that wicked problems require solutions starting yesterday. So when you take years and years to figure out what the solution is, it can put us far behind. And so when you can dig into these issues, like a public health and emergency management, like the interstitiality of that along the timelines, or at the how they relate to the regional and state, and there's communication pieces, just when we can bring those together and make it clear and easy, it's great. So whether it's the communication piece, they can be like highlighting different training opportunities that are necessary, or noting different infrastructure deficiencies too, because I've seen in research the difference between local shelter availability and the cooling space availability, and they're different. And many towns have an emergency shelter and they don't serve as cooling space. And some cooling spaces don't have air conditioning, which is pretty insane. So those types of things, if you can note, either there's some regulations, disconnect of regulations, or there's lack of data, like GIS data, for example, or there's training opportunities. All of those are really helpful to make it clear what the options or the menu could be of solutions. Maybe that was clear as mud. Not sure.
Oh, I completely agree. There's a lot to be done. And like you said, it's very difficult when the problems have tentacles that reach into various sectors.
Elle, when you were doing your interviews with like local EMDs, did you find that there was a difference in what people constituted as an emergency or as a hazard? Did you have to prompt, like I know, from our experience, sometimes we have to prompt people in local meetings to say, well, have you had heat-related issues? Are there vulnerable populations that are, don't have access to cooling centers or that you're worried about? Is there something that you find that those EMDs are focusing on more, like these huge natural disasters that happen every 10 years, or is it flooding events, or was there not really
we asked sort of, is there a specific type of hazard event that you're most concerned about? And the answers ranged dramatically. Wind, some of them did talk about routine, right? Just because it depended upon region. So, flooding was a more common issue. But some of them were really worried about, what happens when the big hurricane hits. Wind-related outages and power outages were very frustrating because, a lot of EMDs talked about influx of new residents from urban areas after COVID, and residents that, as there was a lot of frustration by EMDs that were talking about the fact that, people, they don't see it as an issue until it's an issue for them, and people will buy generators and then return them when they didn't need them. And so they talked about that gap in knowledge. I mean, I had one EMD say, well, if everyone could just figure out how to take care of themselves, then we would be okay. Well, that's an issue, right? Because that can't be the threshold. So there wasn't necessarily one type of hazard that seemed to stick out to people necessarily. What kind of surprised us was more the discussion of the precarity of the position. And it didn't necessarily matter what the hazard was. There was an overwhelming sense that these towns didn't have the capacity to meet the needs of the residents, nor the residents the awareness and the knowledge to take care of themselves. And what happens when that happens more frequently. And there was a lot of discussion of comparison between the bigger towns, right? It was, the Gold Coast that have full-time staffed personnel versus, right, the small rural area that has one guy in one room in a town hall from the 1800s with, one filing cabinet that's alphabetized. They talked about those types of kind of discrepancies within the state and what happens to those small towns that no one's necessarily paying attention to.
Yeah, totally. Matt?
A different topic, but I do think, thinking about solutions, I think the regions can play a significant role, and I'm looking forward to you doing some research here in Prague. Because we have a very close working relationship with DEMIS Region 3, which really helps us out from a planning and then a response standpoint. But that's not uniform across the state.
Yeah, and they are differently equipped. And the regional coordinators were really fabulous sources of information. And definitely express their concern because they're looking at, all of them have a range of towns and teams of personnel that they're overseeing. And so they could really speak to sort of the obvious disparity that came across the wealth gradient across areas.
Yeah.
And so,
oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, just an added observation. Certainly the wealth, but I think also scale. So at Prague, we have dedicated public safety and emergency management staff. They're teaching a regional ICS class in our conference room as we speak. But most COGs don't have that.
Right.
So
Yeah.
factoring that into the equation, I think is helpful.
The bigger towns and the EMDs that were responsible for bigger areas, talked about how, they could prepare an emergency management plan for every local event, right? Every parade, that they had the resources and the equipment, whereas other towns just say, well, we haven't updated it because frankly, we wing it. And that's kind of what we have to do. And so the scale of the town differed dramatically. And yet, even across different scales, that issue of the problem associated with volunteerism continued to come about, even in the larger areas, right? Volunteer firefighters, for instance, or even having enough paid firefighters was a challenge. And so you saw that as more of a consistency across the area, while you did see larger towns and larger communities having more assistance overall and being in better status overall. The problem with volunteers was across the board.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, going back to something you said a bit earlier, Elle, about the frustration that you were seeing with the EMDs and how a lot of people, weren't signed up for those alert systems. And if there's not something happening right now that is, needs attention, if there's not an emergency right now or a hazard right now that needs attention, it's like in a lot of people's, in the back of their mind. Maybe it's like there, but not really there. So yeah, is there, do you have any thoughts about how to, and I think anybody in the planning climate change fields could, attest to that. It's really hard to get people to take it seriously and to be forward thinking. So is there any, do you have any ideas on how to make that happen?
No, there's some interesting, I mean, from an academic perspective, I have a communications colleague who had a graduate student that was working on creating an virtual reality headset for those who have not experienced the loss from a natural disaster, to simulate loss from a natural disaster and thus kind of get the mindset of preparedness. I mean, that's like way into the spectrum, but you're talking about a human behavioral reaction. I've looked at this, and even in the Colorado, in the Front Range, in terms of forest fires, and Chris Burton's work. Joanna just mentioned Chris Burton's work in New Orleans following Katrina. You consistently see that those who experience a disaster and experience that disaster from a perspective of having suffered a loss or damages or costs are much more likely to heed warnings moving forward, because the event tends to have kind of like a Doppler effect, where in social time it seems much more recent than it might actually seem in linear time. Whereas those who perhaps were inconvenienced and didn't suffer a loss or a cost don't necessarily heed warnings, and actually maybe even more vulnerable in subsequent events, because frankly it was just an inconvenience to prepare or to evacuate. And so overcoming, it's not just sort of how do you get people to pay attention, it's almost more like an overcoming a human behavioral default to just say, well, I don't know what that's like, so I can't necessarily embody it. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. The AI thing is,
yeah.
I don't think they actually did it. But there were things, but the little things, I mean, and this goes back to communications as well, which is not my area of expertise. But for instance, I believe it was in the last 5 years or so that the National Weather Service stopped putting everything in capitals because it was difficult for people to actually read.
Mm.
So it looked alarming, but it actually was it took longer for people to actually ingest the information. And so while that doesn't necessarily motivate action, just little things to make those messages get through a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, interesting. Looks like Joanna just wrote in the chat. We are also seeing impacts where they didn't happen before, so the risks and therefore knowledge of where or how they respond doesn't yet exist. Yeah, especially across the community.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what some of the MDs were really saying in the context of new residents.
Yeah. So it looks like we're closing in on the
about
hour.
that time.
Yeah, does anybody have any last thoughts? Okay.
And if not, I think we'll just say thank you, Elle. This
Yeah.
was fascinating. And thank you to everyone who contributed to the discussion.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the discussion and the suggestions and the ideas. And I really look forward to kind of talking with some of you moving forward as well.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.